Okey-dokey. All righty then. Take two. Welcome to the end of July. Distant dad. A little late. Better late than never, I suppose. We're going through Ricardo Bellafiore's article on the multiple meanings of Marx's value theory. It's a relatively straightforward article. Not so many technical terms, although I think some terms will become problematic, and we'll talk about that. So from the top, Marx's critique of political economy is grounded in his value theory. Critique has to be distinguished from criticism. Marx aimed not only to point out the errors of political economy, but also to learn from its scientific results. Here the key names are Francois Quesnay, Adam Smith, and David Ricardo. Marx was also interested in assessing the conditions and the limits of the knowledge provided by classical political economy. At the same time, he saw the critique of the science of political economy as the means to develop the critique of capitalist social relations. Among Marx's unique contributions was that his value theory is the only one consistently put forward within a monetary analysis. That is, it introduces money in the very initial deduction of value. In fact, Marx's object of inquiry is capital understood as a social relation of production defined by two main traits: the exploitation of labor within a monetary commodity producing economy and an internal tendency to crisis. The connection between money and class exploitation on the one side and the endogeneity of crisis on the other is related to the view that in a capitalist economy, the value added, that is a monetary magnitude nearly produced in a given period, has its exclusive source in abstract labor as an activity. More precisely, in the living labor of wage workers. In a nutshell, Marx's reasoning may be considered a macro-monetary theory of capitalist production. In the capitalist production process, the totality of wage workers reproduce the means of production employed and produce a net product. The net product is expressed on the market as a new money value that is added to the money value attached to the means of production, historically inherited from the past. This value added is the monetary expression of the living labor time that has been objectified by the wage workers in the period. The value of the labor power for the entire working class, which is exhibited in money wages, is regulated by the labor time required to reproduce the capacity for labor, and hence by the labor time required to reproduce the means of subsistence brought on by the market. Accordingly, the surplus value, that is value added less value of labor power, originates from surplus labor, defined as the positive difference between, on the one hand, the whole of living labor spent in producing the total, that is the net product of capital, and on the other, the share of that living labor which has been necessary to devote to reproducing the wages, which Marx labels necessary labor. The Marxian critique of political economy is inseparable from the meaning Marx gave to the labor theory of value, which in this case was rather a value theory of labor. The issue is how relations of production and circulation are affected by the fact that labor takes the capitalist social form of producing value and surplus value embedded in things, in commodities. In what follows, I will look at Marx's value theory from 5 perspectives: as a monetary value theory, as a theory of exploitation, as a macro-monetary theory of capitalist production, as a theory of individual crisis, and as a theory of crises. A monetary value theory. Marx's starting point is that capitalism is an economy where commodity circulation occurs through universal monetary exchange. The analysis of exchange as such is given priority relative to the analysis of capitalist exchange, and money is introduced before capital. In exchange as such, individual commodity producers are separate and in competition with each other. The labor of these asocial individuals is immediately private and becomes immediately social on the market. Socialization of labor goes on indirectly through the selling of commodities. Each commodity is shown to be equal to the others in certain quantitative ratios. The commodity has a use value, but it also possesses an exchange value. Though invisible in the commodity, it is externally exhibited in money as the universal equivalent. At this stage of Marx's original argument, money must be a special commodity with universal purchasing power, gold, as a result of historical process of selection and exclusion sanctioned by the state. The equal validity of products sold on the market is in fact an a posteriori equalization of the labors producing them. Thus, labor is not social in advance, but only insofar as its true output will be money, a form of generic or abstract wealth. Individual labor, which is concrete labor, producing an object with some utility for some other agent, that is the social use value, counts for the producer as its opposite, as abstract labor. Abstract labor is a portion of the total labor exhibited in the money value of output. It is then also a portion of the gold-producing concrete labor, the latter being the unique, immediately social labor. The value of money is fixed when gold first enters monetary circulation in the original exchanges with other commodities. Although private labor becomes social labor only through money as a universal equivalent, it is not money that renders the commodities commensurable. On the contrary, commodities possess an exchange value because even before the final exchange on the commodity market, they have already acquired the ideal property of being universally exchangeable, giving them the form of value. This property, so to speak, grows out of an objectified labor as the substance of value. The form of value in the individual commodity is a ghostly entity, but it materializes by taking possession of the body of money as a commodity. The internal duality is now redoubled in the external duality of commodity money. Money is nothing but value made autonomous in exchange, divorced from commodity and existing alongside them. And as the form of value, it is the outward necessary exhibition of abstract, indirectly social labor. Now, I know that seems a little complicated, but I think if you can see that the process is what creates this abstraction, it is not the physicality, but it is rather what results from all of the activity. This qualitative analysis of exchange as such has a quantitative counterpart. Qualitative analysis of exchange as such has a quantitative counterpart. The magnitude of value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time needed for its production. Socially necessary labor time has two meanings. Production must run according to average techniques and intensity determined by intra-industry competition. But it's also driven by the paying social need, what Marx calls ordinary demand. In a particular branch of production, each commodity of a different type and quality is sold at the same money price. Hence, the magnitude of value is ruled not by the individual labor time actually spent by a single producer, that is, by its individual value, but by the labor time that has to be expended under normal conditions, that is, for example, by its social or market value. The magnitude of value is inversely related to the productive power of labor, that is, the labor time required to produce the commodity given the prevailing labor of level of intensity. Commodity values are necessarily manifested as money prices. The quantity of money that is produced by 1 hour of labor in a given country and period may be defined as the monetary expression of labor. The magnitude of value of a commodity multiplied by the monetary expression of labor gives the so-called simple or direct price. You can already see that these are all abstractions, that expressing labor is not labor itself. It is just simply labor communicated in that sense. From this perspective, it is always possible to translate the external monetary measure of each commodity's value, ideally anticipated by producers before exchange, into the imminent measure, this is where it becomes Hegelian, into the imminent measure in units of labor time. Note, however, that value is not identical with price. with the latter price defined as any arbitrary relative ratio between commodity and money fixed on the market. Value instead expresses a necessary relation with the abstract labor time spent in the production of commodities. To be effective in regulating market prices, value implies a coincidence between individual supply and demand. In that case, the spontaneous allocation of the private labors of autonomous producers affirms itself a posteriori, after the fact, on the market as a social division of labor. Price is the money name taken by commodities, and since individual supplies and demands may well diverge, price may in turn exhibit a labor amount that differs from the socially necessary labor contained in the commodity. The whole mass of newly produced commodities is a homogeneous quantity of value whose monetary expression is necessarily equal to their total money price. The discrepancy between values and prices simply redistributes among producers the total direct labor, that is, the content hidden behind the money form taken by the net product. I know that sounds all very abstract, but you can see the level of abstraction applied to this in order to create things that are more generalizable or universal, which they're not fully universal, of course. But you can see that certain averages are being created from this activity, and that they are by necessity abstract. This approach to value theory, where value eventually comes into being in money, may be characterized as Marx's monetary value theory. In it, value and money cannot be divorced. It is formulated most clearly in the opening pages of Capital, where Marx moves from exchange value to value, from value to money, and from money to labor. It may be attacked on several grounds. In his famous critique of Capital, the 19th century Austrian economist Eugen von Bauwerk failed to notice the essential monetary side of Marxian value theory, instead looking at only what he saw as a linear deduction in the sequence exchange value dash value dash abstract labor. Quite reasonably, from this limited reading, he observed that abstracting from specific use values does not mean abstracting from use value in general. Moreover, an exchange value is also attached to non-produced commodities. It follows then that hidden behind the notion of value are the common properties that allow for exchange in the market, namely utility and scarcity. All of this is trying to, simplify what seems to be something made more complicated. At the very end, it's trying to reach something that defines it probably a little bit more laterally across all types of activity. A more recent criticism stresses that while the backward connection from money to value is convincing, less so is Marx's idea of an absolute or intrinsic value, justifying that inverse movement from the inner dimension of value to the outer dimension of money. Marx himself shows that the social equalization among labors is achieved only when commodities are actually sold in circulation. Before that, in production, we meet only concrete labors, which are heterogeneous and non-additive. A theory of exploitation. All these positions ignore the fact that for Marx, commodity exchange is universal only when the capitalist mode of production is dominant. That is, only when workers are compelled to sell their labor power to money as capital, as self-valorizing value. Consequently, labor is for him the content of the value form because of a more fundamental sequence going from money capital to living labor to surplus value. The private individuals who are distinct and opposed on the commodity market, where they eventually become social in capitalist terms through the metamorphosis of their products into money, are now to be interpreted as the collective workers organized by particular capitals in mutual competition. This is why this appeals as a matter of explanation to the working class, or as a working class argument. To explain the origin of the value added, and thereby of the surplus value contained in it, Marx begins from two assumptions. Supply meets a demand of the same amount, and commodities are sold at prices proportional to the labor required to produce them. This is simple or direct prices. The argument is based on a two-step comparison. First, he sketches a hypothetical situation, but one that expresses something very real and significant in capitalism, where the living labor extracted from wage workers is equal to the necessary labor required to produce the historically given subsistence. Historically given subsistence. It is a situation of simple reproduction without surplus value, akin to Joseph Schumpeter's circular flow, where the rate of profit is absent. In the second step, Marx imagines, or rather reveals, the actual prolongation of the working day beyond necessary labor imposed by capitalism. The extension of the working day beyond the necessary labor time creates a surplus labor and its monetary expression, surplus value. Note that this is applying this process to something at scale. This is more problematic when you apply it to an individual producer, but if you apply it to sort of a larger scale entity, you can sort of see how this works out, how this magnifies in a way that can be intelligible. It's less intelligible if you're an artisan, sort of working within the context of a small workshop. It's much harder to understand these relations. In this argument, some points must be noted. First, Marx does not abstract at all from circulation. Account must be taken before the capitalist labor process of the buying and selling of labor power on the labor market and the way subsistence is determined. He must also assume that the potential that is latent value within the commodities produced will be confirmed as a social use value in circulation. The metamorphosis of the commodities into real money must happen according to sales expectations. Moreover, to make clear that abstract living labor is the only source of value, Marx must abstract from the tendency towards the equalization of the rate of profit between the branches of production. Throughout the first and second volumes of Capital, Marx ignores static Ricardian competition as the tendency towards the equality of the rate of profit among industries. Already in the first volume, however, he cannot avoid considering dynamic, that is Schumpeterian competition, the intra-industry struggle to obtain extra surplus value. How a labor market operates in some ways. The diversification and stratification of the conditions of production is determined by the innovation and spreads the rate of profit within the sector. The generativity of the surplus is an endogenous variable influenced by the social form taken by production as production for a surplus value to be realized on the market. With given industrial techniques and assuming that competition on the labor market establishes a uniform real wage, necessary labor is constant. See, he's already trying to keep some things constant to get the math to work out. Surplus value is extracted by lengthening the working day. This is the simple example. Marx calls this method of increasing surplus value the production of absolute surplus value. When the length of the working day is limited, whether by law or through workers' resistance, capital may enlarge surplus value by the production of relative surplus value. In other words, if you set in, for example, an 8-hour working day, this places pressure to produce relative surplus value. That is through technical innovations or by speeding up the pace of production, a greater intensity of labor. Technical change, which increases the productive power of labor, lowers the unit values of commodities to the extent that the changing organization of production directly or indirectly affects the firms that produce wage goods. Necessary labor falls, and with it, the value of labor power. This makes room for higher surplus labor and thus a higher surplus value. That's in the basic sense with, depending on the application of the organization of work and the application of new technology. Changes in production techniques yielding relative surplus value are a much more powerful way of controlling worker performance than is the simple personal control needed to obtain absolute surplus value. That is the length of the workday, for example. Moving from cooperation to the manufacturing division of labor to the machine and big industry stage, a specifically capitalist mode of production is developed. Here, labor is no longer under a formal subsumption to capital, which with surplus value extraction occurring within the technological framework historically inherited by capital, but it is under a real, as opposed to formal, subsumption to capital enforced by technology, that is, a capitalistically designed system of production. Workers, the human bearers of labor power, become mere appendages of the means of production, a means of absorption of labor power in motion, that is living labor. This is what Musk tried to do by attempting to fully automate his factories. The concrete qualities possessed by laborers spring from a structure of production incessantly revolutionized from within and designed to command living labor. At this point in the argument, labor does not only count, but really is purely abstract, indifferent to its particular form, which is dictated by capital, and in the very moment of activity where it has lost the nature of the active element and become the passive object of capitalist manipulation in the search for profit. This stripping away from labor of all its qualitative determinateness and its reduction to mere quantity encompasses both the historically dominant tendency to de-skilling and the periodically recurring phases of partial re-skilling. This is similar to the idea that you remove the raw materials from the original source, take it somewhere else, have it manipulated, and then sell it back. This is this idea that it becomes de-skilled at the original source. All you need people there is to pick stuff and not necessarily to learn anything. A moment of reflection is needed to appreciate the special features of this unique social reality where labor is made abstract already in production. Profit-making springs from an exploitation of workers in a double sense. There is first exploitation through the division of the social working day, with laborers giving more living labor in exchange for less necessary labor. The perspective here is that of the traditional notion of exploitation, which considers the sharing out of the quantity of social labor contained on the new value added within the period, the putting out system. Its measure is surplus labor over and above necessary labor. This, however, is the outcome of a second, more basic exploitation of workers in the form of the use of workers' labor power. Capitalist wealth is created only on the condition of this consumption of workers' bodies and minds, which perverts the nature of labor. The quantitative measure of this productive notion of exploitation, which refers to the formation rather than the distribution of the fresh value added, is the social working day in its entirety. From this second perspective, exploitation becomes identified with the whole working day and with the abstract living labor of wage workers. This is the ultimate reason for tracing back value to labor because of the value form taken by labor. So what Marx is trying to show is that a certain set of relations becomes mystified, and it becomes, it becomes generated in a certain way, but begins to separate form from appearance. Your relation to the activity has become abstracted in that sense. Marx shows that abstract labor reflects an inversion of subject and object, what philosophers would call a real hypostatization, which is deepened in the theoretical moment back from the commodity output market to the labor market and the production process. This theoretical movement's really, it happens in an instant on the one hand. On the other hand, it's really important to identify. Within commodity exchange, objectified labor is made abstract because the products of human working activity, as long as they're commodities, manifest themselves in an independent and estranged reality, divorced from their origin in living labor. The consequent alienation, this separation of individuals, is coupled by a reification and fetishism. In other words, new meaning is invested in things. Reification because in commodity capitalist economy, production work relations among people necessarily take the form of an exchange among things. And fetishism because as a consequence, the products of labor seem endowed with social properties, as if this were bestowed upon them by nature. That is, an object that makes you more attractive to the other, for example. These characteristics reappear in the other two moments of the capitalist circuit, on the labor market, human beings become the personification of the commodity they sell. Labor power or potential power. Within production, living labor or labor in becoming is shaped by capital as abstract labor and embedded in a definite technique and organization specifically designed to enforce the extraction of surplus value. Abstract labor in motion as the activity producing value with money as its result is the true subject of which the real individual workers performing it are the predicates. In this way, Marx's capital as self-valorizing value is akin, to Hegel's absolute idea, seeking to actualize itself and reproducing its own conditions of existence. But it is potentially limited by workers' resistance to their incorporation as internal moments of capital. So here you see the sort of mind and body sort of issue that Hegel is trying to deal with, that there is something being taken away, something being carved off, but you only sort of notice it on the one hand at an individual level, at some individual level of consciousness, but isn't only fully realized until you sort of see yourself as a larger group of people who this thing is happening to. At this point, it's possible to understand behind the anarchic social division of labor carried out by private producers independently of one another and affected after the fact, a posteriori, via the market, a different technical division of labor within production is taking place. In the latter, inasmuch as it's subjective to the drive of valorization, an a priori despotic planning by capitalist firms leads to a technological equalization and social pre-commensuration of the expenditure of human labor power, tentatively anticipating final validation on the commodity market. This process imposes on labor already within direct production and before exchange the quantitative and qualitative properties of being abstract labor spent in the socially necessary measure. Even though capitalist production is completely actualized only in exchange, and therefore single capitals in competition are not guaranteed to find an outlet for production, individual workers are immediately socialized in production. So this is the generalization that places emphasis on the production process, on productivist relations. That is because of the alienation and estrangement that occurs on the production side. Before there's some actual realization occurs, you have to sort of this is what is dehumanizing about the particular process. Capitalist production is the paradox of a dissociated firms whose production is in common, but have yet to appear as part of the total social labor in the eventual validation of the commodity market. This pre-commensuration of labor and socialization within production, in its turn, is conditional on a monetary anti-validation expressed by the finance for production that money capitalists grant to industrial capitalists. This is speculation. You put out money expecting that, well, I'm going to need X amount of workers to use, Y amount of equipment to get this sort of thing out there. And there's no commodities yet, so we have to sort of wait until that happens. So a lot of it is fronting the money. That's where, credit comes in. For Marx, once capitalism has reached its full maturity in large-scale industries, the subjection of wage workers to capital, with the consequence, ex ante, abstraction of living labor already in production, and hence the theory of exploitation must be seen as the foundation of the monetary value theory. Now, this may be a little bit of tautological sort of manipulation here. Well, we inserted this, so therefore it must be the beginning of the process. So that's where this, the question, the congealment question, et cetera, is always raised. But you have to see it not so much as the labor itself, but the expectations about labor. That is some sense of future value that will occur after this whole process has occurred. And yet it's not unreal. It's not fully abstract. It is, always has its roots in some person actually expending labor. Now, the fact is, whether you can apply this as a measure of other kinds of things is going to be the real, the question. A macro monetary theory of capitalist production. I have therefore surveyed two interpretations. Remember, he's looking at 5 different things. two interpretations of Marx's value theory: as a monetary value theory of value and as a theory of capitalist exploitation. Here I will summarize a contemporary analysis that may link these two: an approach to the value theory as a macro-monetary theory of capitalist production. This interpretation was put forward by the Italian economist Augusto Graziani as part of his version of the theory of monetary circuit. And it has the advantage of revealing a hidden Marxian current in the work of bourgeois monetary heretics of neoclassical theory. That is Knut Wicksell, Schumpeter, D.H. Robertson, the Keynes of the treatise on money, as opposed to the Keynes of, talking about fiscal policy, etc. According to both the Marxian view and these monetary heretics, the capitalist cycle or circuit is logically split into a sequence of successive phases. First, initial buying and selling of labor power on the labor market, where money wages are bargained. You offer up X dollars per hour. Then immediate production, where you actually use the labor power, and eventually the final selling of commodities at the moment of circulation, where real wages are eventually fixed. In other words, you're not, you sort of promise a certain wage, but some of it is kind of contingent. That's kind of why fixed wage labor rates are kind of problematic, because it doesn't allow for the flexibility of, market conditions, leading to the reconstitution of the money capital, which has been advanced. If we distinguish money capitalists from capitalist entrepreneurs, this series follows the tripartite separation of Graziani's macro agents in the most abstract picture of the monetary circuit. Remember, we've been talking about multiple circuits. Financial capital, industrial capital, and the working class, where before you had only, sort of industrial capital in the working class. Now you have more means of circulate only within the firm sector, out of reach of the wage workers, whose purchasing power can only materialize in buying the means of consumption that the capitalist class makes available to them. This is a giant leap. In other words, a fully enacted economy must occur. The defining features of Marx's value theory can be characterized as follows. It is, first of all, a class macroscopic analysis, which leads directly to a description of the capitalist economic process as a monetary circuit. In the cycle of money capital, money is initial finance from the banking system, allowing the firm sector as a whole to purchase labor power from the working class. Money, before being the universal equivalent in circulation, that is, this is the social relation in circulation, the social relation among capitalists in some ways. The possibility of crisis arises when money is hoarded, money bins, because of the pessimistic prospects of capitalist entrepreneurs or money capitalists, and brings with it unsold commodities and involuntary unemployment. Crisis is a break in the circuit, a point which encompasses both Keynes's view of crisis as the result of a rise in liquidity preference, that is, failure to close the circuit. Money keeps changing in quantity, and Circuitous' view of crisis as an outcome of capitalist entrepreneurs' reluctance to invest, failure to open the circuit. That is, opening and closing the circuit here is an important moment. Remember, I've talked at great length, or not, maybe not enough at great length, about these different interrelating, intersecting circuits. There are many of them, and they exist, they're in constant motion. Now, valorization means an enlargement of abstract wealth. In a truly macro monetary perspective, no exchange internal to the firm sector can contribute to valorization. If we assume Marx's macro-social, monetary, and class point of view, it is clear that surplus value, that is gross profits, cannot originate in external exchanges within the capitalist class. Inter-firm transactions can only give way to profit upon alienation or profit upon expropriation, canceled out at the level of the firm sector as a whole. The genesis of surplus value can be found instead and the only external exchange for capital as a whole. That is the one between capitalist firms financed by banks and the living bearers of labor power. So Marx is trying to show that, and this is an oversimplification because in reality, that's not quite how it occurs. There's time intervenes, etc. But he is trying to make it relatively simple as an explanation. Following Michael Kalecki's revision of Rosa Luxemburg's argument, the level, composition, and distribution of output can be easily determined. The autonomous capitalists' expenses for investment and their own consumption fix the amount of their profits. Their market power expressed in the degrees of monopoly defines the profit share on income, and from here it is straightforward to derive the level of output, income, and employment. In this view, in a capitalist economy, the totality of the means of production must go to capitalist entrepreneurs. Thus, the entrepreneurs must be able to buy all the new means of production which have been produced. The profit margin must then be set at a level such that the mass of profits is equal to realized investments. It is noteworthy that in this reconstruction of Marxian theory, what the working class actually receives are the consumption goods that firms put on the market for them, even if they're household savings. Financial wealth allows individuals to modify their consumption stream over time, but it is irrelevant for the aggregate. A reduction in saving is followed by higher real consumption by workers only if the firm sector autonomously decides to increase the supply of wage goods. Even shares represent a fictitious ownership as long as the decisions over real production are out of workers' control. This fictitious ownership is where you're getting real problematic elements, as in financial capital. This does not mean that distribution is immutable. It can change. However, workers exert influence on firms or governments' decisions about the real composition of output through non-market actions, that is, conflict in production or struggles in society or political interventions. On the Marxian theory of money, Graziani also offers some original insights. We must distinguish money, Geld in Marx's original German, from currency, Münze. The former represents abstract wealth in general, while the latter is the universally accepted intermediary of exchange and is one among many representatives of wealth in general. So already you see some nuance in this definition. If we accept this distinction, the valorization process is therefore then defined as money dash commodity dash more money, or the simple algebra M dash C dash M prime. While and remember that M prime is M plus delta M, which means that there is some sort of calculus-like change that has occurred. While the monetary circuit enabling its reproduction is defined as currency, commodity, currency. It follows that the specific goal of the capitalist is to acquire money in the sense of abstract wealth, not to acquire money as currency. This is the contradiction of the money bin. When Marx discusses the nature of gross profit, he makes clear that it is acquired by capitalists solely in the form of commodities. Remember, this entire system is one built on certain concrete things, but the concrete things always signify a set of abstract values that has reality and transforms reality in that particular context. While Marx stresses that currency as a means of circulation in commodity markets is itself a commodity, currency representing money as a form of capital must be a form of credit, and more specifically, bank credit ex nihilo. That is, there's always some institutional guarantee in some ways for this idea of money as a form of capital. It's got to be translated as credit, and the only people who can guarantee these things are institutions like banks. The role of currency as bank credit ex nihilo is not made explicit in capital because when Marx writes of money and currency, specifically in volume 3, he does not present a pure theory of the monetary circuit, but only an inquiry into what we call the practice of money markets. Moreover, he assumes an open economy and the presence of the state. It has been suggested the assumption that money is a sign, like that made by the monetary heretics, threatens to undermine Marx's theory of exploitation, since money as capital may seem to be valueless. This is not so. The problem of the value of money as capital is reduced to the problem of determining wages, because in a class macro-monetary approach, the only purchasing power of the advancing currency is the number of workers hired. This is the wage bill. Following the general principle of the theory of value, the value of the real wages of workers is equal to the given subsistence real wage. So another viewpoint is a theory of individual prices. In other words, you can accept all three prior visions of what this is all at the same time, and that seems incredibly complicated, but if you think of them as sort of all of these little Venn diagrams overlapping, it's not that much of a problem. Well, maybe it is a problem, but try to be open to that. A theory of individual prices, the macro-monetary reconstruction, like the other perspectives on Marx's value theory I presented, deflates the theoretical drama, which has been going on for a century or more, about the so-called transformation problem. This debate centers on Marx's value theory as a theory of the determination of relative prices. The conclusion many drew from the discussion was that Marx failed to transform the simple or direct prices proportional to the labor contained in the commodities exchange, sometimes labeled labor values, into the prices of production, containing an equal rate of profit and systematically diverging from simple prices. It is sort of the easiest way to explain it to folks in a popular public way, but you sort of need to go through this, as we've looked at before, a certain system of abstraction in order to get these sort of nuances to reveal themselves. That, like the difference between money and currency. The reason is easy to understand. In volume 1 of Capital, Marx focuses on the rate of surplus value, identical to the rate of exploitation. That is, the surplus value divided by the money capital spent in buying labor power, what Marx calls variable capital. In other words, you put out the sign, workers required, and then you see all the contingencies built into it, no Irish, no Chinese, no whatever. The rate of surplus value is positively related to the length and intensity of the working day. It also rises with increases in the productive power of labor, which is positively affected by the capital composition, that is, the ratio between the money capital advanced to buy means of production, labeled by Marx constant capital, right? Remember, land and machines and other kind of stuff, and variable capital, that is, workers. Surplus value springs only from the use of labor power bought with variable capital and not from the means of production bought with constant capital, hence their respective names. There is something, there is a slight separation between these two. The rate of surplus value explains the origin of gross profits for total capital. Confronted with the working class as a whole, total capital extracts the new value as exhibited in money of the living labor of the working class and pays back the value of labor power as exhibited in the necessary labor. In other words, there's already a little separation going on. However, for the individual capital, the success of an investment is rather measured by the rate of profit, the ratio between total surplus value and total capital, the sum of variable capital and constant capital. So there's a kind of aggregation that's going on here. Because of inter-industry static competition, the rate of profit tends to be equal among branches of production. Here the problem is said to emerge. The rate of profit is positively related to the rate of surplus value and negatively related to capital composition. The rate of surplus value tends to be equal in every industry, but there is no reason for capital composition to equalize across industries. Commodities, including the elements of constant and variable capital, cannot be evaluated at labor values when inter-industry competition is introduced. Hence the need to transform these labor values in prices of production with a rate of profit helping to determine the elements of variable and constant capital. So in other words, you need a way to sort of figure out how you're going to get the surplus value. And you do this by playing around with, by using another figure, as it were, another idea, another monetary thing, a signifier to work this out. I will not go into the intricacies of this debate. The point is that whatever the opinions on the technical details of the transformation, the problem simply cannot exist as such. It's a pseudo problem. If the core of Marx's value theory is taken to be the a posteriori, that is the after the fact socialization of labor on the market against the universal equivalent, the argument may be put forward that there are no actual labor values before the eventual validation of the final market. In other words, there's still stuff that it has to be realized at some particular moment. There's only a single system of prices, and the assumption of simple or direct prices is just a law of exchange to be removed at a lower level of abstraction. And yes, much ink has been spilled over this actual sentence. The vision of Marx's value theory as a theory of capitalist exploitation, tracing back surplus value to the extraction of living labor from human beings as bearers of labor power, is even more radical. The point there is that valorization arises from the social relation of capital and workers in the capitalist labor process as a contested terrain through class struggle and production. This is where all the antagonisms are. And the antagonisms exist at one hand at the wage rate level, right? Some people want to get a higher wage, et cetera, because of subsistence. I have a big family, blah, blah, blah. And what the capitalist wants out of this same kind of antagonistic process. Accordingly, the extraction of living labor meets specific social difficulties for the buyers because the labor power sold by workers, and hence the living labor to be extracted from them, are attached to the sellers, who in capitalism are supposed to be free and equal individuals. Thus, the new value produced in the period cannot be the monetary expression of living labor alone. Whatever the rule of price is, the ratios by which commodities exchange cannot but redistribute the new value. By definition, gross profits appropriate a share of workers' living labor. So there's just sort of tautological sort of connection between this. So since you've created this abstraction for certain things that measure how you're being exploited, it is ultimately part of this process and continues on, at the new values. The macro monetary theory of capitalist production complements this argument, assigning a more fundamental role to the labor values hidden behind simple or direct prices as a price rule. In fact, it's maintained that in the macro social argument, in the first volume of Capital, the relevant price between class macro agents is the rate of surplus value, adequately expressed through simple or direct prices. The reason is easy to see. The new value added by current production is identical to the monetary expression of living labor, and the value of labor power is the monetary expression of the labor contained in the real wage of the working class. Ipso facto. All this occurs independently of saving behavior. There's nothing to do about, holding on to stuff. And we may add, it remains true, whatever the ruling price system. As Graziani argues in a quite extreme but effective fashion, Marx's theory of value has nothing to say directly about the phenomenon of the prices in final commodity circulation, since valorization has already been accounted for in the macroscopic class analysis, which includes the buying and selling of labor power in immediate production. In other words, there's no kind of direct connection, but it is there. It's still there as an abstraction, but it has that representation. Now, the way it's been, analogized or made metaphor is this congealment issue, which we should not take literally. It's just figurative. The macroeconomic inquiry into valorization is prior to the microeconomic determination of individual prices. And this is actually a very key point, and one that is not made in the standard course. At stake in the latter are not the relations between total capital and working class, but the exchange relations of single firms. The determination of prices of production may well give way to a disparity between the labor commanded in exchange by gross profits and the labor contained in production within surplus value, and between the labor commanded in exchange by the money wage bill and the labor contained in production within the real wage for the working class. This needs a diagram. However, this unequal exchange can only obscure the process of valorization, not erase it. So there's a mystification. It's a kind of walnut shells and the pea sort of a game. It's a shell game, kind of. The new value, and then the living labor extracted by total capital from workers, and the value of labor power, the new value and the value of labor power, and then the necessary labor required to produce the given real wage of the working class remain the same. The new value and the value of labor power remain the same. And it's sort of a necessary assumption on the one hand. Both the Marxists and their neo-Ricardian or neoclassical critics who dealt with the determination of prices of production within a simultaneous exchanges perspective, that is, everything occurred at once in a single period, were unfaithful to Marx because they overlooked the process that constitutes the equilibrium position. Now, this is the first time that equilibrium is mentioned, and you have to remember that equilibrium, as described, is on the one hand a mathematical thing. On the other hand, and I like to do it this way because it makes at least more sense to me, and in some ways identifies Marx's later interest in both chemistry, soil science, and geology, etc. And that is that it's more like a chemical equilibrium, or the equilibrium that perhaps you learn in high school chemistry. In fact, because it's potentially always dynamic in that sense, something is always going on, oxidation, whatever. In fact, Marx's value theory, as it has been depicted here, is a non-equilibrium theory. This is something intrinsic to all the foregoing accounts of Marx's value theory. The value eventually comes into being with money as its phenomenal form. That is the monetary value theory, that class struggle and intra-capitalist competition affect the extraction of living labor. That is, this is the theory of exploitation, that something is agitating to do this, as well as in the view of the essential monetary anti-validation of labor power as potential labor through the financing of production, the macro-monetary theory of capitalist production. In other words, there is the implication here that you need to get all this sort of straight before you start doing the exploitation. There is a set of expectations about the completion of the process in some circuit that you cannot necessarily foresee. So there's an uncertainty that's built into this. Non-equilibrium refers to the constitution of the economic magnitudes, allowing us to distinguish afterward between equilibrium and disequilibrium. That is, this idea of constitution, or this idea of constituency, or things which constitute a process. It is about the process, and that constitution, like even a constitution of laws, is one that is very difficult to apply absolutely, but always is a kind of living document, a living organic kind of thing. To some people, you could call it natural, but then that would be confusing the issue. This is not a temporal, but a logical rereading of Marx's value theory. In my understanding, as Bellafiore's, this duality of value theory, an out of equilibrium perspective embodying both an equilibrium and a non-equilibrium, is at the core of David Harvey's notion of anti-value, which has eluded many commentators. You know, you do have to sort of buy into this idea that you have opposites that drive the circuits, and anti-value is certainly one way of thinking about it, even though David Harvey claims he's not a Hegelian. Another controversial area in Marxian political economy is the theory of crises. This is our last little theory here. According to Marx, accumulation, i.e. the conversion of some portion of surplus value into additional constant and variable capital to produce more surplus value, is a contradictory process. Crises are at once necessary explosions of the contradictions and temporary solutions to them. Capitalism's tendency toward instability is already evident in its structure as a monetary economy where commodity exchange is universalized. For some of the separate and autonomous firms, the anarchy in capitalist social division of labor may easily lead to an incomplete realization in circulation of the value potentially produced in immediate production. The presence of money dissociates sales from subsequent expenditures so that hoarding may disrupt the smooth sequence of money, of supply, finding its own outlet on the market as incomes are spent. Most of Marx's inquiry in the 3 volumes of Capital, however, rests on the assumption that commodities are sold on the market at their social values in volumes 1 and 2, and then, of course, at prices of production in volume 3. Something akin to Keynes's basic model in the general theory of fulfillment of short-term expectations. This is where Keynes understands this kind of Marxian question. It is the reason why the Soviets were very attracted to Keynes's general theory during a certain period of its heyday. In volume 2 of Capital, drawing on an original insight, Keynes, Marx constructs his schemes of reproduction, which show that a balanced growth path, independent of the level of consumption demand, is a theoretical possibility, a balanced growth path. Marx divided social output into 2 departments, the first producing capital goods and the second consumption goods. This is Department 1 and Department 2 in Volume 2, which may, of course, be subdivided into wage goods and luxury goods. That is, wage goods are subsistence, luxury goods are, fancy stuff. The value output of both sectors is seen as the sum of its 3 constituent parts, i.e. constant capital, variable capital, surplus value, CVS, small c, small d, small s. In simple reproduction, capitalists unproductively consume the entire surplus value, resulting in 0 growth. This is, you could even say this occurs in an elemental form in some feudal modes of production. In enlarged reproduction, they more or less completely invest surplus value in new constant and variable capital, allowing for accumulation. This is plowing the stuff back into production, which the scheme clarifies is that each value component of the output is also a component of demand for its own or the other sector. Equilibrium, which is always possible, depends on some balance among intersectoral trades. This is that dynamic component of it. The equilibrium is not static in that context. Against Malthus and Sismondi, Marx affirms that capital may expand over time without meeting a barrier in effective demand because it's the mainspring of its own demand. This is that kind of Malthusian sort of growth thing. Nevertheless, against Ricardo and Say, Marx also states that since equilibrium needs exchange in definite, quote unquote, correct proportions, and not only in value, but also in use value and money terms, a balanced long-run accumulation is not a guaranteed outcome, but rather materializes by accident. And yes, there are actually equations for this, and this is the Harrod-Domar growth models, which kind of deal with this problem of large-scale, long-term growth. The likelihood of departures from equilibrium because this absence of planning simply reflects the possibility of crises occurring in a market environment. This question is that there's kind of an indeterminacy, but yet Marx instead seeks to explain the necessity of crises arising from the capitalist class relation itself. In his view, failures of effective demand issue from a fall in investments, which itself proceeds from a profitability crisis. Thus, the question becomes one of understanding the systemic, recurring causes of profit shortfalls. A first argument is described in the general law of capital accumulation at the end of volume 1 of Capital. Assuming a constant composition of capital, a sufficiently rapid growth in the value invested exhausts the supply of labor power and tightens the labor market. Wage increases outpace the rise in the productive power of living labor, the rate of profit starts falling, and consequently, accumulation and demand for labor slow down. A more lasting solution to this difficulty, located in distributive struggles over the partition of the new value added, is the introduction of labor-saving, capital-intensive methods of production. For a given capital, mechanization reduces the share of variable capital and thereby the demand for labor to produce the same output. It displaces workers, replacing them with machines. So that in the simple Marx model, you see you're introducing new machines, but it displaces workers. People become unemployed. They need to go out and find another company that hasn't introduced the new machines, perhaps, or some other kind of thing. Change locations. Theoretically, a rise in the accumulation may enhance or reduce employment according to the relative weight of the two forces, the increase in the size of capital and the change in its composition. Through the cycle, the pace and structure of the accumulation of capital, that is, capital is an independent variable here, constantly vary to reproduce an industrial reserve army of potential workers ready to be included in the valorization process, exerting a downward pressure on wages, the dependent variable. A permanent downward pressure on the real wage, that is an absolute impoverishment of the workers, is among the possible outcomes. All the same, the normal situation is very different. Capitalist accumulation is propelled by the production of relative surplus value, which presupposes a positive dynamics of the productive power of labor. The real wage then has room for improvement without impeding the tendency for a greater share of the surplus value in the new value added to go to the capitalist class, as long as the increased level of workers' consumption is expressed in a lower value of labor power. This is what Luxemburg called the tendency towards a fall in the relative wage, i.e., a contraction in wages as a proportion of national income, a relative, not an absolute impoverishment. This is because, Luxemburg is observing the, problems in the German economy of the period and trying to reconcile it with Marx. On the other hand, with the rise of trade unions in a more militant working class, wage struggles can become partially independent from the labor market, break the tendential fall in the relative wage, and develop into an independent cause of capitalist crises. This is when you have strong unions. And strong unions mean like full industry control, the ones that really muck up the process. Or in the case of certain types of activities, they have a kind of monopoly power that is in a rail strike, for example, or government workers, if they were truly unified. Mechanization of production is also an autonomous drive for capital to control living labor and to remove workers from the point of production. If mechanization is a powerful lever to regulate both the exchange value and the use value of labor power, it nevertheless creates a further difficulty. The rise in what Marx calls the technical composition of capital, the physical ratio of the number of means of production to the number of workers employed, contributes to the expulsion of workers from the productive process. But workers' living labor, we know, is the exclusive source of value and surplus value. According to Marx, the consequent rise in the composition of capital expressed in value terms yields a tendency of the rate of profit fall. It must be noted, however, that Marx expresses the quote-unquote law with reference to the rise in what he calls the organic composition of capital, in which the elements of constant and variable capital are evaluated at the prices before the diffusion of innovation, and not in the value composition of capital, in which these elements are evaluated at the prices after such diffusion. This is a simple, well, it's not that simple, but this idea of when you estimate what is worth what changes the argument, or is it kind of, it could be a simple assumption that can actually become very problematic. The latter definition fully reflects the revolution in the evaluation of constant and variable capital produced by mechanization, whereas the former measures inputs at the original prices. The organic composition follows the increase in the technical composition, but the trend in the profit rate depends on the value composition. The clarification of the distinction between physical value and organic composition of capital, among physical value and organic composition of capital, was a fundamental contribution made by Ben Fine and Lawrence Harris in the late 1970s, and developed more recently by Alfredo Saad Filho. Some authors have interpreted the tendency of the rate of profit to fall not only as the cause of cyclical crises, but also of capitalism's long waves, that's Kondratiev. And others have considered it the reason for a secular downward trend in profitability. There is some justification for this view. The application of greater quantities of constant and especially fixed capital per unit of output is the most effective means to propel surplus value extraction from workers. Marx thought that the increase in the rate of surplus value could not compensate in the long run for the negative influence on the rate of profit of the higher value composition of capital, and so he downgraded it as a mere counter tendency. Marx's strongest argument in favor of the law is an appeal to the absolute limit to the surplus labor that may be pumped out of a given working population. To understand what is involved here, it's best to view the composition of capital as an index of the ratio between, on the one hand, the dead labor contained in the means of production, and on the other, the living labor expended in the period that is to represent it as the ratio between constant capital and the sum of variable capital and surplus value. C over V plus S. Assuming that variable capital is tending towards zero, and thus that the whole social working day is objectifying itself as surplus value, the value composition of capital becomes the reciprocal of the maximum rate of profit. This latter can be seen as the ceiling for the upper movements of the actual rate of profit. Yes, there's a lot of algebra here, but when you go back to it, you can see that generally they all share the same issue about small c, small v, small s. This latter can be seen as the ceiling for the upper movements of the actual rate of profit. Marx suggests that the numerator for the upper movements of the actual rate of profit, Marx suggests that the numerator for the maximum rate of profit meets a natural constraint in the amount of living labor that can be extracted from workers, while on the contrary, its denominator is free to grow without limits. So it grows in a fractional way. As the ruling social values, individual capitalists are willing or forced to introduce more capital-intensive methods of production. In this way, they lower unit costs to gain excess temporary profits, but the longer run effects of their behavior force a reduction of the social values of commodities and hence depress the average rate of profit. So all of this as, trying to explain the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Nevertheless, to deduce a necessary fall in the rate of profit would be unjustified because progress in the productive power of labor, accelerated by mechanization, ends up reducing the values, that is, the prices of all commodities, and therefore also those of the means of production. It cannot be excluded a priori that the devaluation of constant capital might even be strong enough to raise the maximum rate of profit, removing the barrier to an actual rate of profit. The latter is both a positive function of the rate of surplus value and a negative function of the composition of capital. Another criticism is thus that there is no reason to exclude the possibility that the rise in the rate of surplus value can offset possible, but not necessary, rise in the value composition of capital. In other words, you can have offsetting effects sort of in the short run. It is interesting to observe that the higher the rate of surplus value soars, and thereby the more the tendency for the rate of profit to fall is repressed, the more likely the system is to run into a third type of crisis, that of realization. Some Marxists have indeed suggested that the rate of profit falls because actual or expected effective demand is insufficient for the system as a whole to buy commodities at their full value, including the average rate of profit. Two conflicting positions have been dominant in this group of theories. One approach, that is of Hilferding, for example, stressed that disproportionalities, that is, sectoral imbalances between supply and demand, were intrinsic to a spontaneous, chaotic market economy. If excess supply persistently affects important branches of production, this can spread to other sectors and easily degenerate into a general glut of commodities. This kind of difficulty, however, depends on the speed of price and quantity adjustment to disequilibrium and may disappear in a more organized form of capitalism. Some of its proponents, such as Mikhail Tugan-Baranovsky, even ended up endorsing the idea that being production for production's sake, capitalism encounters no true barrier in effective demand. and in principle sustain a balanced growth path with declining consumption. The other approach, associated with Luxembourg and others, is sometimes wrongly labeled underconsumptionist, though in fact it stresses underinvestment. It maintains that the net investment could not compensate for insufficient consumption forever, since the long-term profitability of new machine goods depends on future outlets. And these latter are less and less predictable, with a decreasing share of consumption and total demand. The same reproduction schemas prove that the intersectoral trade proportions required for expanding reproduction are precarious and unsteady. An increasing extraction of relative surplus value, which is needed to overcome the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and which strengthens the tendency of the relative wage to fall, shifts them continuously, making them unlikely to be met for long. For some of these theorists, such forms of realization crisis are of increasing severity and lead to a final breakdown when the external factors mitigating them, such as net exports to non-capitalist areas, are exhausted. This is part of the imperialism stuff. Other writers in the same tradition as Kalecki objected that the insufficiency of effective demand may be solved what he dubbed domestic exports, that is, government budget deficits financed by the injection of new money. Indeed, Luxembourg already hinted at something of this kind in her original argument of the heading, under the heading of military expenditures on arguments. You can see it where all this sort of fits together and where they're not that different. A similar role may be played by unproductive consumption by third persons, drawing their incomes from deductions from surplus values, rich people. To be compatible with a stable accumulation of capital, these solutions called for continuing pressure on living labor. This confirms the role of the rate of surplus value as the pillar of capitalist development and of the outcome of the class struggle within the capitalist labor process as the crucial determinant of its dynamics. A rereading of Marx's theory of crisis looks at the tendential fall in the rate of profit as a meta theory of crisis. You know, already you have a theory of crisis, but now you have a theory of the theory of crisis, incorporating the different kinds of crises that can be derived from Marx and extending them to a historical narrative of the evolution of capitalism. This is essentially why we have people like Piketty out there. You know, this is, you're trying to work through some of these historical narratives about where are the problems coming from. From this point of view, the tendential fall in the rate of profits due to a rising value composition of capital was confirmed during the long depression of the late 19th century. The increasing rate of exploitation needed to overcome the tendency was implemented by assembly line production, Fordism and Taylorism, and speed up, etc., efficiency of production, which jointly strengthen the tendency for the relative wage to fall. The rise in the rate of surplus value, however, created the conditions for a realization crisis, and the realization crisis occurs in the great crash of the 1930s, the so-called golden age of capitalism after the Second World War. You see, we're still all in the same places with all those graphs, was predicated on a higher pressure on productive workers to obtain enough living labor and gain even higher surplus labor. This in turn opened the way to a social crisis of accumulation because of the struggles within the immediate valorization process, a key factor in the stagflation of the 1970s. The stagflation was caused by a variety of things, including, of course, sort of resource crisis, fossil fuel, blah, 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 blah. From this point of view, the so-called Great Moderation leading to the recent Great Recession, if not lesser depression, must be interpreted as capital's reaction to a crisis originating from a rupture in the same capital-labor social relation with production. Great Moderation, of course, was a misnomer coined by Ben Bernanke in 2004 and founded on the delusion that finance and business cycles were at last under control. Needless to say, an aspect of this is how Bernanke got his Nobel Prize, whatever. Neoliberalism is best captured as a real subsumption of labor to finance and debt within a Minskian money manager capitalism, the subordinated integration of households into the stock exchange market and their descent into bank indebtedness. As I've argued several times with Joseph Halevi, even before Minsky, the tendency to household private indebtedness was captured by Paul Sweezy and Harry Magdoff as a powerful counter tendency. And Sweezy developed a reading of the new phase of capitalism in terms of financial dominance. The other side of the coin was the deconstruction of labor in the new phase of capitalist accumulation, characterized by new styles of corporate governance, multinationalism, leading to a centralization without concentration, and then to a weakening of workers in the labor market and in the labor process, offshoring. This form of capitalism was based on a capital market inflation, which, though it stabilized the system for a time, has proven unsustainable. Now, I know that it was hard to follow, but essentially what Bellafiore has done is try to explain in not strictly Marxian terms, but in intelligible Marxist terms, the way in which the economy ebbed and flowed, the reason why it kind of fits certain Marxist ideas, noting, of course, that there are contingencies built into the argument that you need to focus on models of the economy using money, and that you need multiple theories, what some people refer to as a multimodal or a multi-application approach to explain all this stuff. And yes, it's incredibly complicated, but as Rick Wolff has tried to explain, there are multiple entry points to a complex economy, and you need to get a sense that what Marx is talking about is various aspects of trying to explain certain relations between capital and labor, and that these relations are the key to all of these kinds of problems. The issue, of course, is space and time issues, which is why David Harvey is important, to try and see when and where certain things are applied. Often, people, in order to try and explain to people why you're being exploited or whatever, gets really complicated. It's not complicated when we sort of assume that, the data is there. It's just that there's certain power in a propagandistic sense over how that data is explained and organized. And often, if you design a system that simply operates off of one set of assumptions, you wind up thinking that that's the only way the economy can be read. And in fact, it isn't. Okay, so I got to the end, and I know that it's probably confusing people, but I think it's important to remind you that there is no one theory of value. There are a multiplicity of them, each with their own kind of contribution to the discourse, and you need to sort of treat them in relative importance to see that, oh, okay, we can apply this at this level of the argument, but once we start including other things that we haven't really introduced into the model, credit and debt, and long value chain, demand chains, and blah, 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 it can get really ugly. So, all right. So I've yacked far enough and probably lost a few people in the process, which I did. I apologize for being late, and perhaps there are questions. I will now.
Yeah.
Yes. Not just that capitalism had tendency to fail, but it's because of capitalists. It is because of capitalists. It's an agency issue. That none of it can be blamed on workers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really chaps my hide. So, I watched the two videos at the top there, I guess a couple of days ago, and the one from Wolff was enlightening, where he talked about this sort of silly idea that the capitalists are the entrepreneurs or the risk takers, and in reality, every worker is taking a risk.
Yes.
Every damn day, practically, but
exactly.
There's that, and then also, there's this kind of silly idea that ideas are important, or that it was the capitalist idea to make this choice, right? When in reality, as a worker, you generate ideas every damn day, kind of thing.
Absolutely.
And so that, I guess, sort of flows out into that notion that I guess there's this propaganda going on that kind of obscures the reality of the situation, is that it's the screwed up system that's screwed up by the the major actors in it.
Yeah, yeah. It's by who owns the system. It is. That's the sort of bugaboo of AI, right? AI, you could say that it replaces labor, but it does more than that. It does a whole bunch of other things that it is promised, but cannot realize, or creates other kinds of things that are sort of unforeseen. The fact that Teslas can run over people on motorcycles or whatever.
There was one point back there, where they sort of say, "Oh, this is where it gets Hegelian," and I wanted to understand that a little bit better. Is that where it's like abstract labor is sort of one perspective, but then that's from the producer's perspective, but then there's a flip side of that coin, for the laborers themselves. Is that where it becomes
Yes,
Hegelian?
yes. That's
Okay.
that master slave thing, right? It's the codependency between master and slave. The moment where you accept the abstraction, then you actually have a kind of power. Well, that's one way of extrapolating it.
Right.
Capitalists need workers. They'd love to get rid of us all, but they really can't quite do it. But it's really hard to explain to people. I mean, you just sort of see this process, and they're offering wages like that down the street, so maybe I should go there. Blah blah blah. It's just
Yeah. Yeah.
and it could make one crazy by saying, well, if we all know this, how come we're not changing it? Well,
Right.
some people have more power over the means of imagination.
Yeah, yeah. And then as soon as, it just baffles me because in that Wolf video, I was reading through some of the comments, and like 80% of them are these libertarian chuds, talking about how has Wolf even read Capital? This sort of thing. And I'm
Well,
like, oh my
Wolf's
God.
a product of the kind of Althusserian kind of approach. I mean, he's not orthodox. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy studied with Althusser himself, so whatever. I mean, you really can't help but have all these things sort of assimilated. And yet,
Right. And yet they're like, saying he had, it's just kind of crazy to me. It's like there's a whole herd of them out there, and they've all got this crazy
there's
idea.
a whole herd of them out there. Indeed, there are.
and probably none of them, they're all workers, probably,
Yes, they are. Well, it becomes an issue of faith, right? And I mean, it's a kind of fantasy. The so-called workers' paradise, right, got oversold to a lot of people. It just
Well, even a knucklehead like me can kind of grasp that I'm getting screwed here.
Well, that's the importance of having real, with all due respect, liberal education, because you can actually see it all in flux. You can see that it's not a doctrine or dogmatic. If you actually compare it to the other people writing at the same time, you can see, oh, okay, well, this all kind of represents, these other guys represent a kind of class point of view, a protecting of, landed property, the gentry, the capitalist class. And you see Marx going, well, it's not quite it. And, even though I'm from sort of the bourgeois class, my allegiances are proletarian, whatever. And hence my theory sort of looks at this way to try and work through some of the contradictions. And they're credible contradictions.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, no, thanks for looking at the video, because I do think that the vids are good, and it's Rick Wolf has been at this for a while.
I was also trying.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I was trying Medium can read the article to you, so you can listen to it, and my sort of absorption is different when I'm listening to it. tend to get distracted more easily. But and it was also going a little too fast, so I was trying to figure out how can I slow it down a little bit. Would it sound weird?
Well, you just get the tape and play it back at slower speed. Play me back at slower speed. Oh God.
Well, yeah, right, yeah. Got the YouTubes too.
Yeah. So, this is but the last couple of things I've gone through are kind of things that try to create a complete picture, a more complete picture. One should never say that it's complete, but a relatively current, complete picture of how history has gone. And you have to see it in some kind of framework, because if you don't, you're just going to fall victim to this whole problem again. And it can change. I truly believe it can change, even though through our lifetimes we begin to see, oh shit, it's not changing within my goddamn lifetime. Well, maybe my kids will get it or something. No, I truly believe that there was going to be some cataclysm somewhere in the 60s and 70s, that something would break and then we would get, better control over the issues, but it got worse.
Yeah, hopefully that.
I mean, and it turned into this weird thing, America becomes the superpower, the super hegemon, the only hegemon, and it got worse. From that point of view. But yet we still have mechanisms to change all of that. I still think we do have mechanisms to change that. We still have control over the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, sadly to say, as badly organized as it is. I still think things can happen. On the other hand, you've got, international capitalism doing its thing.
So we're often very critical of so-called, actually existing socialism, say the Soviet Union. But has any, reliable, non-ideological research been done into comparing the living standards of the average Russian with the average Russian Soviet?
I think there have been. I think there have been numerous actually comparisons, but it depends, as they say, on how you want to measure it, I guess. The fact that you always had medical care of a sort, the fact that you always were housed, however problematic that might be, those are kind of important things. But it really depends on how you want to measure it. I mean, if it's happiness you want, we all should move to Scandinavia, right? Because we're just not as happy as they are, right, Joe?
Oh, he's getting out.
Oh,
he's getting the hell out of there.
It's too cold to be out.
Yeah, well, so I was wondering what those studies say. I mean, obviously, it depends on how you measure it, and that's why I mentioned the ideological lens. Because
if you were building it on if you're building it on consumption or acquisition, the Soviets were never doing as well, and then you had this monstrous black market, which I think that those measurements have never been fully, probed. Those are all the macro problems. Try to estimate what really was going on in Europe, in that hemisphere, as opposed to our hemisphere, whatever. I don't know. These are always problems. No, it's not a matter of trying to argue that the Soviet system was a superior system, because it was always running at a kind of weird deficit. Whether it was I mean, you can argue, and I don't like, it's a terrible argument, but, losing a lot of people actually was a good thing from the World War II point of view, that it was sort of necessary to have the war, the Great Patriotic War. But, there's no reason to, it just happened, and the awfulness of it is even more complicated. So I just think that measuring the macro measuring of a standard of living, I guess we have standard of living measures, but they're kind of weirdly relative, right? They're
Well, I mean, there must be a way to, talk about food security, employment security, um, housing security, consumption, healthcare access, and affordability. The basic things of life that people are most concerned about.
Well, there are measures of subsistence, and I think that that's why we have a UN in some ways, is to level out some of the analysis, so it doesn't have the kind of distortions built into it. Some people are never going to own Cadillacs. Some people don't want to own Cadillacs.
Yeah, I mean, if you exclude Moscow and St. Petersburg, and you look at the people living in Russia, compared to, say, the 1970s and the Soviet Union, I just wonder, how much of a difference there is. And is it a positive difference or a negative difference?
Well, it probably was terrible, and considering there were sanctions and embargoes and all kinds of other craziness going on, and there were some things that were manipulated by what has evolved as, and this is an arguable point about state capitalism in Russia, just to use the Russian example. It's never been very equitable, although I think that some things, that people managed to get through it. Although I think that there was this whole Russian thing about a kind of Russian cynicism that is lasted from the 19th century, that kind of, allows people to rationalize all the kind of brutality that exists. I mean, in that sense, it's still an underdeveloped country. And just looking at the current Russia. And in fact, how can you even talk about the current Russia? You really only have to talk, I mean, when you're trying to measure things, it's really complicated, considering how all of the stands and all of the other republics are really run very differently.
So
Right,
fast.
that's why I was comparing Russia rather than, the other republics that were part of the Soviet Union.
Well, I think probably the better analysis, or with all due respect, is the sort of first, second, third world kind of comparison, which, if you aggregate it, yes, first world was always doing better than the second world, even though there were some, really existing socialisms in the second world. But the first world overwhelmed it ultimately, and it kind of self-destructed. The second world self-destructed. The repudiation of Stalin and blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of stuff that's going on there.
Yeah, I think the destruction though was I mean, there was a pretty heavy hand on the scale.
Oh yeah,
to
yeah,
make
yeah,
sure
yeah.
it
Of course, of course. I know you have a lot of strange actors going on, and
like $1 trillion Cold War, that type of thing.
oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you manufacture it because you need to keep the military Keynesianism cranking along, right?
Yeah,
We need
of
an
course.
enemy. We needed
Still
a damn
going
enemy.
today.
They copped our stuff. They copped our secrets. They're really bad people.
Oh
They're going
yeah,
to take
you
away our
got
radios, whatever. God. And hence, in the current political situation, that's kind of what we have now. So anyway, I should conclude, since I've yammered far too much without even having my coffee. So I will thank you for those who have stuck it out. I do hope you have a chance to read it. It does have technicalities in it, but it is a relative simplifying of the entire Marxian argument. That is, capital, the Marx's Capital kind of the bare bones of it are actually there. It explains pretty much everything, that there's a money problem, there's a crisis issue, there's all of these things are there. They exist in the current discussion, and in fact, you could do it as you can see in kind of one article. You can see all of the different issues that are at work. You can see the foundation of the modern money theory problem. You can see the remainder of the issue on accelerationism, that crises are manipulable. And, there's some people that still believe that you can, drive the whole thing forward with an accelerationist plan. It's really difficult, but, whatever. And so those are the kinds of things. And I think it's important to have this thing that shows, well, there is capital, there is labor, and there is some complicated set of relations that often we rationalize because, well, you've got credit cards, you own property, you need to do stuff, you got a family, blah, blah, you need to work through this. We are still in the mode of production called capitalism, and we still got to work through it. Some people have tried to solve it by becoming venture capitalists, that I can control this, and they can't, as you can see, human failings, destroy one's position in that case. But, we do what we have to do. And looking at the larger system that is the geologic, the Holocene, whatever, there's stuff that's happening bad right now. Climate, as in climate. So I'll thank you, and I will, or if Joe is still here, we can